goes to be with the Lord. So what you need to deal with as a Christian is that smelly old coat. You need to get it off. That's why Peter uses the verb strip off, which means to take off dirty clothes and throw them. In 1 Peter 2, get rid of that stuff. We are not a remodel job. I want you to know that. That we are not just something to which something was added. I don't believe that a Christian has two natures. I think a Christian has one new nature. I dies, ego dies, I lives. So that a Christian is a single new man, a total new creature, a new living I. But sin is a problem because he's got a smelly old coat of humanness on him. And what the Bible approaches is the fact that we need to begin to throw that old smelly stuff off. The new man is a new kind of human behavior. And we are to put on a new man, that is a new humanness, to accommodate and fit and go with a new nature. But most of us have to fight to get rid of that old stuff. In Colossians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul says that if we have been risen with Christ, in other words, the old I died and a new I rose, if we are a transformed, brand new nature, risen with Christ, then certainly we better kill the members on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil desire, covetousness, etc. In other words, you got to get rid of the stinky old coat. When I went down to the Union Rescue Mission years ago and I preached down there, they showed me the de-licing room, where they go in there and de-lice. And some got a whole bunch of those things on them, and it's quite a job. And they burn their clothes. It wouldn't do a bit of good to de-lice a guy and then put him back in his old bum clothes. Nobody'd believe he'd had a bath. Got to get a new garment for a new man. And the same thing is true in the spiritual. As we have a new nature, as we have been recreated in Jesus Christ, as we have been made new, as we have been transformed so that we now, right now, this moment, are ready for eternal heaven, our nature is ready. Then we need to chuck the old patterns, the old things, the old practices, the old life that hangs on us. Christ is formed in us. Paul even said that. He said, oh, I have birth pains until Christ is formed in you. Galatians 4:19. It is the very life of Christ in us. And we are, it says in Ephesians 2, created in Christ Jesus. But the struggle is with that sin, that coat of sin that is our humanness. Now, Paul is going to attack that very issue right here. He's going to tell us from chapter 4, verse 17 to the end of this book how to get rid of that old coat, how to chuck that old stuff, how to accommodate a new suit for the new man. That's his whole point. We have learned what the new man is in the first 3 chapters, right? Now we're going to learn how the new man lives in the last 3. He talked about the new nature and all that was involved in chapters 1 to 3, and now the new clothes, the new man, putting on the new man, putting off the old external, the old outside, the old man. It's kind of like Romans 6:13. If it's true that we have risen with Christ, if it's true that we're brand new and transformed, then we should never yield our instruments as instruments of unrighteousness, but we should yield our members as instruments of God. Now, the reason the Bible is so full of the word therefore is because it is incumbent upon us to behave in accord with who we are. That's why the Bible is loaded with therefores and wherefores. In fact, chapter 4 would be a good illustration. Verse 1 has a therefore. Verse 17 has a therefore. Verse 25 has a wherefore. Chapter 5 has a therefore. And the whole of the Christian life is a pile of therefores and wherefores. Why? Because it is demanding from us a response of obedience to the identity that God has given us in Christ. Now, we're going to look at how the new nature functions in behavior in the new man. That's our thought as we examine this text. Now, I want you to go back to verse 1 so we can really pick up the context. Chapter 4, verse 1. I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you that ye walk worthy. Now, we can stop there for a moment. All right, that's the whole thrust of 4, 5, and 6, the worthy walk. I beseech you that you walk worthy. Worthy of what? The vocation to which you're called, the new nature, the identity that was delineated in chapter 1, 2, and 3. Walk worthy. Now, how is that going to work? How do we walk worthy? Jump to verse 17. Here's the first way. I say, therefore, testify in the Lord, that you henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk. Now, here's the first thing he really has to say directly about walking worthy. It is a different walk. We are to live different than the world lives. Now, there is some debate about whether the phrase other Gentiles walk is in or out in certain manuscripts, and for our sake, we'll include it because it's implied if it isn't in, and I lean to the fact that it's probably in the text anyway. But the point is, the idea here is that we are to walk worthy, verse 1. And then he gives that wonderful interlude in verses 2 to 16 about unity and spiritual maturity and growth as a sort of a composite of the church. In other words, he's talked in generalities about how the church is to function, and now he gets specific. Now here you as a believer face the fact of what he wants you to do. How am I to walk worthy? First, walking not as other Gentiles walk. Now, the therefore, then, I think, picks up all of verse 1 to 16. It's a debate about what the therefore applies to. I think it applies to the whole thing. Because of the vocation to which you're called, because it is humility that God is after and meekness and lowliness of mind, because of the truth that we are one in every way, because the Lord Jesus Christ has gifted us uniquely as members of His body, because He has given to the church the principle of maturity and growth and edification and speaking the truth in love. Because of all of these things, therefore you are to walk. It's as if He's saying God has created a marvelous entity in the world known as the church. And because of this unique creation, with a unique lifestyle of humility, with a unique unity, with a unique empowerment by gifts and gifted men, with a unique destiny of being edified in love, because of the marvelous uniqueness of this miracle creation called the church, this is how you are to walk. You see the totality of what the church is designed to be. Now here you as an individual are to behave in this manner. So he moves from the general to the specific. You say, all right, I'm a part of this church. I know the gifted men are to do what they're to do and perfect the saints, and the saints do the work of the ministry. I know you've given me spiritual gifts. I know I'm to know this unity and this oneness. I know I'm to be humble and meek. Now, how do I work it out in my daily life? How do I live it in the world? Principle number 1, you don't walk like the rest of the world walks. It's a different life. It's unique. You are a unique group. You are the church of Jesus Christ. The world is proud, you're humble. The world is fragmented, you're united. The world is impotent, you're gifted. The world is hateful, you're full of love. The world doesn't know the truth, you do. Because of all these things, and because of the design of your uniqueness, this is how you walk. Different. Different than the world walks. You cannot accomplish the glorious goals of Christ by living the way the world lives. You know, living like the world lives would be imitating the dead. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Not much point. You see, Christianity, and I think it's important to realize this, is like a third race. There were Jews and Gentiles.
And every scar is proof that what tried to kill you didn't overcome you. Struggle is the proof that you have not been overtaken by your enemy. See, everyone wants to be victorious, but no one wants to fight the enemy. See, it's the enemy that reveals the champion on the inside of you. Can you imagine a basketball game if there's only offense? 10 people out there just shooting the ball. Can you imagine a football game and there's no defense? Everybody just tossing it to each other. Everybody just running around, just looking like chickens with their head cut off. Can you imagine a sporting event if there's no adversary? See, it's the enemy that reveals the champion on the inside of you. The only way you can get the victory that you deserve and that belongs to you is go through what it is that you may be going through. And I know it gets tough and I know it gets difficult, but I'm telling you, struggle is the proof that you have not been overtaken by your enemy. Which brings me to point number 2. You got choices. These 700 men had choices. They had to choose to stay in the fight. See, in military now, you get wounded to this level, you don't have a choice. You get discharged. When these 700 men were fighting, they had choices. One of the things that I've learned is we're born looking like our parents, but we die looking like our choices. 700 men had a choice to make. Whether I'm going to go back home with my wounds or whether I'm going to wrap up this wound and continue to fight for what it is I'm believing in. You got choices. See, you make choices, but then choices make you. These 700 men were handpicked because they could not pick their hand. These 700 men were chosen because they had a choice. And it says that they could hit a horse's hair with the sling and a rock, which tells me not only did they decide to stay in the fight, but they decided to use what they had left to be better at what it was that they were believing for than who it was that they were known for. They had a choice whether they wanted to return home or get good at what they had left. How many times did it take them throwing a rock with a sling to hit a horse's hair 30 to 40 yards away? How many misses did it take for them to be known as those that were good at slinging a slingshot with a rock to hit a hair on the string of a tree with a rock tied to the bottom of it from 30 to 40 yards away? Do you know how far 40 yards is? There are quarterbacks that can't throw 40 yards. And you telling me these 700 men perfected their craft with what they had left good enough to take a rock in a sling and hit a horsehair 30 to 40 yards away. Some of y'all can't see the hair on your head right now. And these men had the ability to hit a horsehair 30 to 40 yards away. How many times did they have to swing the sling to determine if they were good or not? I can imagine that they had choices. I can imagine that things got tough. I can imagine the wounds that they were dealing with were severe enough for them to have a good excuse to stay home, but they didn't stop fighting. And I came to tell somebody right now, if you can fight for it, you'll fight to keep it. They had their mind made up that what has happened to me, my condition will not be my conclusion. And they didn't stop fighting. I can remember watching some highlights of my father's favorite athlete, Muhammad Ali. And he would go out and he would do all these press runs and he'd be talking trash. One particular press run was for the Rumble in the Jungle. When they were doing this, I was watching it. My dad had his chest poked out. Son, watch this. And Muhammad Ali's talking trash. And they get to the fight. And the fight is going on. And the fight goes longer than expected. And at the end of the fight, after the fight was over, you could see Muhammad Ali kind of tearing up and crying. I remember asking my dad, why is he crying? And he said, well, son, he had just been through some stuff. He had been through some pain. He'd been through some obstacles. He had been through some trials. And he knows it's a privilege to fight. And I came to tell somebody today, it's a privilege to fight. I don't know what you're believing God for, but if you can fight for it, you'll fight to keep it. I can imagine these 700 men had to make a choice whether I'm going to stay in the fight or whether I'm going to utilize my wound as an excuse to go back to where I came from. But it says that these 700 men made up in their mind, I'm not going back from where I came from. I'm going to persevere and go forward because I believe that there's more on the other side. I know you may be through some stuff, but you got the mentality, I'm still going to fight. I know you've had to overcome some obstacles, but I believe you're in this moment in time right now because you had your mind made up. I'm going to stay in the fight. Come on, look at somebody and tell them you got choices. See, you run from something, you'll find yourself running from everything. If you can run from something, you'll find yourself running from everything. They didn't quit. It got tough, but they didn't quit. It got hard, but they didn't quit. It got severe, but they didn't quit. They lost a limb, but they didn't quit. And I wonder, is there anybody listening to me right now that your mentality is no matter how hard it gets, I'm not going to quit. No matter what the enemy or the adversary may be screaming at me, I'm not going to quit. I've been through a lot, and I've been through over, and I've been
into my text in just a minute. But what's interesting to me is they are much like the Old Testament church coming out of Egypt. And coming out of Egypt through the wilderness toward the promised land, they come out of Egypt almost immediately, miraculously, by the power of God. But they spend 40 years trying to get Egypt out of them. So the disciples have come from this rich Judaistic tradition, but they spend the next almost 100 years trying to separate the infusion of where they came from, because all of us have a perspective that tints the lens through which we see God based on the perspective that we came from. And it is a process of maturing and maturation that ultimately pulls back that skin and brings us to a point that we are circumcised in our hearts, and we begin to see God more clearly without the contamination of where we came from and the biases and the prejudices. So this is the tenor of what's going on. When I start to talk about the lens through which they see faith, there's a couple of things that I want to interject here that I think is important for you to consider. First of all, there is the blood lineage that flows through the Hebrew people, later called the Jews, that goes all the way back to Abraham. Abraham is the father of the faith, but he's also the father of the faith. 3 different religions claim him to be the patriarch of their faith: Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. So it all goes back to Abraham. It all starts with Abraham from a lineage perspective. When it comes to a nation, a nationality of people, it starts at Mount Sinai, and I'm going to deal with that later in a minute. But so far as bloodline is concerned, I want to just deviate for a minute and show you the mystery that God interjects here that gives us a sneak preview of what God has in store and what God is going to do. And I think there's some things here that are going to be important for you to understand. First is who was Abraham? Okay. If you read in Genesis 11, 27 through 30, it says this, and this is a NIV version. This is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abraham. So Terah is Abraham's father. So it starts not talking about Abraham, but talking about his father Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Remember now that Abram does not become Abraham until later in the story. Same person, God just modifies his name to make him the father of many nations. And Haran became the father of Lot. So Haran is Abraham's brother, okay? And so Lot is his nephew. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, in the land of his birth. That's what I want you to understand, that Abraham comes out of Chaldea, okay? He died in Ur, which is modern-day Mesopotamia, which was the old country Mesopotamia and he died in Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of his birth. We don't get to take Abraham and make him whatever nationality we want him to be if we are true to Scripture. The Bible takes away all ambiguity. We don't have to guess. We don't have to research. It is quite clear. Abraham comes out of Chaldea, and in particular, Ur, in the land of his birth. Okay? Let's go deeper. Abraham and Nahor both married. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarai, later called Sarah, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. It's important that we understand that. It's important that we understand where Abraham began, because today there's a lot of debate about who is really Israelite and who is really Jew. Well, we got to go back to bloodline. If we go back to bloodline, we go back to Abraham. If we go back to Abraham, we don't get to make him European or African or Asian or whatever we want him to be, depending on how we feel about it. No. The Bible is quite clear. He comes out of the Middle East. He comes out of Mesopotamia. He comes out of Ur. His people had migrated into Mesopotamia. They did not migrate out of Africa. They are a particular sect of people that came out of the Middle East, okay? And so it is quite clear here that he is Semitic. Okay, so when we begin to talk about Abraham, we must talk about him as the father. That's the bloodline, okay? The bloodline. Now, I want you to be clear about this. So God says in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, and I'm going to read this out of the King James Version, and it may be helpful. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country. Get thee out of thy country. And what is there? The country is Mesopotamia. And from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So there's a couple of things here that I want you to see. Let me read a little bit more. I'm getting ahead of myself. And Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. There's a couple of things that I want you to see. First of all, it was always God's plan that all families of the earth be blessed through Abram. Not just his family, but all families of the earth would be blessed through him. And in order to secure that, from a biblical perspective, there's really only two nationalities. I won't use that word, nationalities. Two groups of people that really matter. Covenant and non-covenant. Circumcised, later called circumcised, because Abram enters into covenant with God through circumcision, and all of his descendants continued that. It was a sign of the covenant. It's not the circumcision that matters. That's the sign of the covenant. The covenant is with Abraham. So those are covenant people. Either you have a covenant with God or you don't. It's not about your age. It's not about whether you're tall or thin or black or white or brown or anything like that. You either have a covenant with God or you don't. And the covenant in the Old Testament was expressed through circumcision. This is important because when we get to Galatians, one of the things that they're fighting about in the New Testament church is, now that we are taking in these Gentiles, should we require that they be circumcised in order for them to be Christians, not to be Jews, but to be Christians? They are wrestling about this. There's another little hint in Genesis 12 that's important for you to understand. Abram starts out as an uncircumcised Gentile.
For what?
Coming up in 20 minutes. Oh my goodness.
We know who want a VCR back. We know who want that.
Coming up in 20 minutes after the hour, we'll talk about Jalen Hurts right after this.
You're listening to the Steve Harvey Morning Show.
Have you ever watched The Exorcist and wondered, are demons real? Well, we interviewed a leading exorcist to find out, and the truth was shocking.
Tell me who you are.
The one you won't get out. The one you can't.
levitations, vomiting, spitting at the priest with an uncanny marksmanship. That has not been a movie for me.
Listen to The Exorcist Files on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Alphabet Boys is a new podcast series that goes inside undercover investigations. In the first season, we're diving into an FBI investigation of the 2020 protests. It involves a cigar-smoking mystery man who drives a silver hearse.
And inside this hearse was like a lot of guns.
But are federal agents catching bad guys or creating them?
He was just waiting for me to set the date, the time, and then for sure he was trying to get it to happen.
Listen to Alphabet Boys on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Fans of the hit TV show Scandal can now revisit every episode on Unpacking the Toolbox, a Scandal Rewatch podcast, hosted by the cast members behind Quinn Perkins and Huck. So, gladiators, grab some Gettysburger and relive Scandal's most iconic OMG moments.
We would be in like 110 degrees in a wool coat.
Yep.
I mean, the chafing that was going on in my pencil skirts, I deserve all the acting awards, people.
Listen to Unpacking the Toolbox, a Scandal Rewatch podcast on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.
If they're coercing people to do it, because they're withdrawing productive factors from the economy to fund that decision. If they want to go to war, for instance, the market may have not selected to go to war, but a government has decided that no, we're going to pull these productive factors from the economy and push us into warfare. So it's contradictory to the essence of democracy itself.
Right, so you guys really see that Bitcoin as you really do see it as a distributed form of government as well, in some sense.
It's disruptive to centralized government, yes.
Yeah, and I think one of the elements of inflation, and again, this is the string back to what we were talking about earlier, and I do think it is a fundamental point to make, but if money is how we express our sacrifices and therefore our values into the matrix of value hierarchies that exist in the market, then inflation is doing so without the commensurate sacrifices that everyone else needs to make into it to allow them to communicate that to the market. And so this is where the idea of pathological hierarchies is applicable, is because a naturally emerging market where the fidelity between one's actions, one's choices, one's valuations, and the signal that they send out into the market is pristine, and I would make the case that's what Bitcoin represents. Whenever that is diluted in whatever capacity, to a small degree or to a larger degree, that's what creates incongruencies between the matrix of value hierarchies that are out in the market. If they are pristine, if we are all able to communicate with perfection our value hierarchies to the market, we will see, in my opinion, emergent order. I don't see how it could be any other way. Where that gets thrown off is when that signal that we're sending carries alternative information, not information that we, through our divine process of mediating chaos in order to bestow value on things and then express that through our actions, not that process, but through some other process of someone who controls the mechanism by which we communicate that. And so inflation is changing the relationship between the matrix of value hierarchies without the commensurate sacrifices, and that is what creates pathological hierarchies, and that's what creates, you mentioned, the inequality and the divisiveness and stuff.
Why do we allow this? We're not going to degenerate into conspiratorial thinking, and I'm always wary of any conversation that involves they, an external actor. Like we've allowed this as a global community, and if what we've done is flawed in the manner that your analysis indicates, why have we allowed it to happen? I could say who benefits, and we could go there to begin with. But again, as I said, I'm very leery of conspiratorial thinking. I tend to think of large-scale social problems as everybody's problem, But so what do you think about that? Why have we allowed this to happen? And let's say who benefits and why, and who suffers.
I'm with you, and 99% of the time I attribute the things that we see in the world that we might term evil or bad to incompetence and not outright evil, not malevolence. Yeah. I think there's many factors here, but one is it happens in slow motion, and so people end up not being able to see it. For example, like you would say today, "Hey, I got my iPhone, I got Netflix, we're talking on Zoom, things are good and right in the world," and I know oftentimes you discuss. not to, discredit, not to go out and try to change the world, not to be too critical of the state of the world, because the order that we experience is almost miraculous. But I would say that there's an element of that may cause you not to see how things have become disordered. I mean, it's difficult to see that. And so when we talk about the disruptive effect of inflation that I just alluded to, a lot of people have a difficult time seeing that. We can objectively isolate problems that are going on in the world, inequality and social problems and, all the craziness that we see in the world, and we attribute that to fill in the blank cause. Whereas I think what we attribute most of that to is the disordering that results from this fractured congruence of value hierarchies that are being communicated in a market. That's where I think most of that comes from, but it takes time to play
so
out.
It's a form of faulty information.
Right, and we are leveraging right now, or we are still benefiting from this the order, the structure that was imposed as a result of, let's say, being on a gold standard and the political and social dynamic that fosters. In many cases, we've been living off the stability that fosters for the last several decades. I think you could make a case that despite technological advancement that might cause us to think, hey, things aren't so bad, or may cause to distract us. I think you can make the case that the equity that we've been living off of that stability is coming to an end. And I think we're seeing that in many different cases. But, I think that's why it happens in slow motion, and people are not educated enough or necessarily paying attention enough to notice the relationship between all the different things that are going on.
Okay, so let me ask you guys a question about what happened in 2008. And so, and I may be completely wrong about this, but my understanding was that the 2008 crisis was fundamentally produced by a technological revolution. And the technological revolution was something like the realization that you could take investments of a certain risk level, mortgages, let's say, substandard mortgages, and by bundling them together in huge tranches, in huge groups, you could quantify the risk. And as a consequence of quantifying the risk, you could discount, you could make the group of investments more valuable than they would be as the sum of the individual investments, which I thought was a brilliant innovation. And so now these companies, banks, traded these huge tranches of subprime mortgages because they could quantify the risk. And that means that could be accounted for financially. And so the risk was ameliorated. And the flaw was, well, no one realized that doing so en masse would increase the probability that housing prices would become correlated across time, across huge geographical regions, for example, across the entire United States. And so the housing market could collapse all at once. But so you could make the case that was actually a flaw in the free market computing prowess, because a technological innovation came along, warped the entire system, and then what had to happen was the political system had to rescue it. And so I watched that and I thought, well, was the political system embedded in the economic system, which is, I think, the argument you guys are fundamentally making, or is the economic system embedded in the political system? And what's wrong with my analysis of what happened in 2008? Wasn't it the case that the market was rescued by the political actors? Is that incorrect?
It's the arsonist putting out the fire. Sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah. No, I could start, and you guys feel free to jump in. So I would first encourage you to look into what's called the Eurodollar system, which is essentially this. We control the pyramid scheme in the U.S., the domestic dollar supply, but there's this offshore derivative system where everyone's trying to peg the dollars that the central bank doesn't control. That's actually been considered to be at the root of the 2008 crisis, and then this was kind of a cover story. But if we just get back to error, so we could say risk is error.
It says you strive. At the same time, he races after us. I mean, this is the crazy thing is not only are we called to strive, but we are relentlessly pursued by God. And so in chapter 15, this is what I want to kind of end with, even though it might be a little bit longer explanation. In chapter 15, tax collectors and sinners are drawing near to Jesus, and the Pharisees are complaining. And it says this, it says, so he told them this parable. So the people are complaining that Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners. He tells them 3 parables: the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the prodigal and his brother, which I like in the Great Adventure Bible, has that title, the parable of the prodigal and his brother, because it's not just simply the parable of the prodigal son. It's also about the older brother. In fact, it's also about the father. But here's the 3 parables, right? He asks the question, which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one, would not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one? Now, of course, the answer we all know, because we've heard this story before, is, well, yeah, you'd all do that. And the actual answer to those hearing Jesus would be, nobody would do that. None of us would do that. No shepherd would do that. Why? Because that is ridiculous, to leave 99 potentially in the wilderness, potentially killed, lost, threatened, whatever, to seek after one stupid sheep who couldn't stick with the rest of the flock. And yet Jesus says, no, but I will do that. I will go after him. I will go after that sheep. And when I find it, when he doesn't beat it up, he doesn't drag it home. He says, when he finds it, he rejoices. He lays it on his shoulders and brings it home, carrying it, which is crazy. I mean, you think this dumb sheep, that foolish sheep that wanders away, like, no, you're walking home. I'm not carrying you home. And yet here is Jesus who is saying, no, I'll put it on my shoulders, carry it home, not angrily, rejoicing. And he goes on to say, when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, for I found my sheep which was lost. That is ridiculous. In fact, that's the point that Jesus is saying, is that you are relentlessly pursued and you are ridiculously celebrated. Because not only does he celebrate a lost sheep that was found, but the next parable of the woman having 10 coins, losing one, when she finds the one, she, as he says, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, rejoice with me, for I found the coin which I had lost. How many times have you ever found something and said, you guys, rejoice with me? No, it's like, oh, stupid, I was dumb, I can't believe I lost this thing. Or finally I found my keys. Whatever the thing is, we don't call together people to rejoice over something that was lost and then found. We just don't do that. But what Jesus is revealing is that he does. What he's revealing is that the Father does. That you are relentlessly pursued, you are ridiculously celebrated. Not only that, but in heaven, just so I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God for one sinner who repents. Listen, when you go to confession, it sometimes can feel like a place of embarrassment. Maybe you might experience it as a place of shame, but it's not. It's a place of victory. It's a place of a joy. It's a place where every time, this is crazy, every time a person goes to confession, every angel God has ever made, every saint who's ever lived, has your name on their lips, praising God. Every tongue in heaven is praising the Lord by crying out your name. That here, Sophia has come home. Here, Rachel has come home. Here, Jack has come home. Here, Mark has come home. This is this incredible thing to the glory of the Father, which is incredible and amazing. And the third story, the parable of the prodigal and his brother. And this is the one that just completely wrecks me. We have this son who wants not only the inheritance, but also he leaves. Now, the one thing he wants the inheritance, right? He wants the stuff that belongs to the father. But then he leaves. And this is even more telling, because when the younger son leaves, what he's saying is, I don't want to be affiliated with you, Dad. Father, I don't want to be affiliated with you. I don't want to be associated with your family. I want out. I don't want to have anything to do with you. It's one thing to ask for the inheritance. It's another thing to take that inheritance and leave. And he goes off, he squanders it, loses everything. He comes home, why? Not because he feels badly, not because he realizes he was wrong. He comes home because he's starving. And this is the humility of God, that we can go back to confession. Why? Because I don't want to go to hell. We can come back to the Lord. Why? Because I need help. And he does the same to us, what he does to the younger son. Seeing him at a distance, he ran to him, embraced him. In fact, another translation said, he fell upon his neck and kissed him. This son is disgusting. And yet the father gives him these 4 things. He says, quick, get the best robe. Then put a ring on his finger. Then put shoes on his feet. And then kill the fatted calf. And let's rejoice. Remember, he's relentlessly pursued. He is ridiculously celebrated. My friend Stephanie Parks, who works for Focus, she and I created this retreat called the Prodigal Son Retreat. And it is just a gift. And in that retreat, we highlight these 4 things. What does it mean that the Father gives him the best robe? You know, in the ancient world, there's not a closet full of clothes. You have a couple robes in your life. You have one best robe. You don't have a bunch of best robes. But the father says to this son, who has been, he's a disappointment. He's a failure. He is not a good son. And he says, give him the best robe, not just one of the robes. Give him the best robe, which is he's giving him the glory of the Father. Then secondly, he says, put a ring on his finger. On that ring would be like a signet, right? The sign of the Father's authority. So not only is he clothing him in the Father's glory, he's putting on his hand the Father's authority. He's fully restoring him to sonship. Thirdly, he says, put shoes on his feet. Why? Because he's free. He can leave if he wants to again. And then kill the fatted calf. There's not a lot of fatted calves lying around. You got one. And that's one thing true. Not only in the best robe, he's clothed in the Father's glory. The ring, he has the Father's authority. He's restored. Not only he has shoes, he's free to leave if he wants to again, but also killed the fatted calf because he is relentlessly pursued. He is ridiculously celebrated. And that brings us to the last point, which is the older son. The older son hears this rejoicing and he is angry. He's resentful. Why? Because the younger son didn't want to be associated with the father and he left. The older son, it turns out, didn't want to be associated with the father, but he stayed. What I mean by that is, he says, look, all these years I've slaved for you. All these years I have served you. All these years I have done exactly what you asked me to do, and you've never even given me a kid to feast on with my friends. Now realize what that means. That means that here is the older son who's not run away, but he's living separated from his father. This is the way that a lot of us live right now. Now, we can associate it. We can see ourselves, our story, in the story of the younger son, but this is definitely our story, the story of the older son. That we say, okay, gosh, man, God wants me to do all these checklists. He has all this task list for me. God has all these things I need to do. I need to get done. I need to jump through all these hoops just to please the Father. And he doesn't actually care about me. No, the older son, he is doing what the father asked him, but he's not living in relationship with the father. Basically, you can imagine him coming downstairs every morning and he just sees on the table a to-do list. But the problem is this. The problem was he waited until the father went out into the field. I'm filling in the blanks here. He waited until the father went out into the field and came down. So the dad had to leave a checklist because here's the older son who doesn't want to be in a relationship with his father. We know that because he says, you didn't even give me a kid to feast on with my friends. He's not grieved because his father didn't feast with him. He didn't want to feast with his father. He wanted to feast apart from his father. He wanted to feast away from his father. He wanted to feast with his friends, not with his dad. Like, you imagine the grief in his father's eyes where it's like, yes, you're finally telling me the truth. You're finally telling me what's meant in your heart. He says, listen, you're my son. Everything I have is yours. And this is the truth that you need to know too, that I need to be reminded of too.
Of how this works, and that when I believe that I've proven a certain skill set with the person calling, that's when I will talk to you about it. I'm not the one who decides whether or not you're going to debate somebody, right, but I'm going to decide whether or not this person is at least up to getting to your attention over it.
Right.
That's all.
Yeah. No question. So anyways, all this stuff comes to my attention a little bit later on because which day was it? I get up one morning and Mike Licona has tweeted and put on Facebook that I have declined to debate his good friend Eric Lunsberry. And on Facebook, he expands upon this and basically communicates to everybody that I like to get into every scrap. I just argue about everything. It was a cheap shot. It was a really cheap shot from Licona. I know he's a part of that group that's very anti-reformed. But I didn't expect that. I really didn't. So I called him out on it. And I said, hey, I don't know who Eric Lunsberry is, but he's already admitted he doesn't read the original languages. He's not a part of a church. And if you think his argument's so good, how about you debate me on it? Because at least that would be considered a fair fight. This guy's not a minister. You know, some people say, you shouldn't be debating this guy. You're going to Southern California to debate. I don't know much about him either, but he's a minister in a church. Lane, if you want to argue about it, complain to Lane Chaplin. He set it up over there in SoCal. But Dr. Licona, I've proven my ability to engage in meaningful debate with a wider range of opponents than you have. So you got no reason to be ducking this one. if you think that Calvinism is the doctrine of demons, as Eric Lunsberry said in the tweet that you then promoted, when do we get together? Let's do it. Two accomplished debaters. We've debated, you and I have debated many of the same places, many of the same people. Shabir Ali, I've debated many times. How about it? So I thought it was a cheap shot. And I really don't expect him to take me up on the offer, but we stand ready. We stand ready. So Lunsberry goes to... What was amazing was that Licona would say this based on a single tweet. That's all I had. They're assuming that, well, since he called and talked to Rich, I know everything about every person that calls Rich Pierce, and so I know all about this. That's what was really cheap and cheesy about Licona's shot, is I'm traveling. He knows what that's like. He knows what living out of a suitcase is like, being 9 hours ahead of the United States in time. So it was just, I was really, really disappointed because, I've criticized some of Mike Licona's debates, but always been very fair about it. This wasn't even slightly fair. I've never been unkind to Mike Licona. He was really unkind to me. So gives you an idea where that group's coming from, I guess. But anyway, here's the problem. The unprecedented refutation of Calvinism that was presented by Mr. Lunsberry is just a tad bit on the unhinged side, okay? Which is sort of what you expect when someone for almost 2 decades is, and is convinced that you're teaching the doctrines of demons. When you think someone's teaching the doctrines of demons, a lot of folks tend to sort of drop being overly accurate in their statements in the process and don't really do a whole lot of in-depth research and reading and study and stuff like that. And so the arguments are very common arguments. I hate to inform Mr. Lunsberry of this, but there's nothing new here, and you haven't discovered anything new. Sorry, I know this is probably devastating for you after 17 years of thinking that you had the light, but other people have tried this exact same approach, which is, well, if Calvinism is true, and I defend and I define what Calvinism says by my understanding, then this verse would not say this. So if God, for example, uses means to judge a people, for example, in the parable of the soils, the birds eat up the word that is put upon the hard soil, so that they may not believe and be saved. And so what Mr. Lunsberry does is he assumes that this creates a capacity and ability that refutes Calvinism. Rather than focusing upon the reality of the parable, which is what the soils are all about, he wants to turn it into a statement about man's capacity. Now, you have direct didactic teaching. Direct, not parables, not inferences. You have direct teaching from the lips of Jesus concerning man's inability, from the lips of the Apostle Paul concerning man's inability. Don't need to worry about that. We have inferences from parables. That's going to win the day. Nothing new about this. Nothing new about it at all. But here's the problem. When you attempt to engage an unchurched, in rebellion against the Word of God, solo prophet who claims to know the heart of God and is being directed around by God, okay? Now, you see, if you were being directed by the Spirit of God, Mr. Lunsberry, the Spirit of God that inspired Hebrews 13:17 would be convicting you of that. So maybe that's not the Spirit of God that you're feeling. Thought about that? I mean, I sort of have to point that out to Mormons when they talk about the Spirit of God. They might need to point it out to you too. But here's the problem. Meaningful conversations would generally include a positive theological explication from both sides. So in other words, when Michael Brown and I debated at Southern Evangelical Seminary, one of the key areas of focus was upon the doctrine of God, God's nature, God's knowledge, and God's relationship to time, because that's foundational. Well, it's foundational to a consistent Christian theology. I don't have any way of knowing whether Mr. Loonsbury has a consistent